Well, thank you, Christian. That's a very flattering introduction. I'm not sure I deserve all those accolades, but the case of the talking mongoose, yes. I was rather disappointed to find out when I went to the Isle of Man a few years ago that very few people there in the village where it took place, very few people had heard about it. And it seems to certainly over there have fallen into, they've forgotten about it. But during its heyday in the 1930s, there was worldwide press interest. Numerous journalists from around the world were traveling to this little village. Spiritualists, psychic investigators, all sorts of people were traveling there.
Sorry, I'm not sure what that is.
Let's go to, you know who this is, I'm sure. This is how I first became interested in the mongoose affair, because 20 years ago I started working at the University of London Library, and when you join, they give you a little tour around all the different departments, and they took me to the special collections, and the conservator said, yes, we've got the archives of Harry Price, we've got his magical library, we've got his archives, and he mentioned Borley Rectory and Helen Duncan, Rudy Schneider, and this conservator said, but my favourite is the talking mongoose, and it kind of rung a bell. It rung a bell. I must have read about this, I think, in the Usborne books of the unexplained when I was young, and I thought, oh yes, well I'll pop down at lunchtimes and I'll go through the archives, and it will be very simple, I'm sure, to work out whether this was a fake or whether this was genuine. But the more I delved into it, the more well, some people said I was obsessed. And, you know, aside from Price's archives, I was going to Cambridge to look at the Society of Psychic Research archives, going to the Isle of Man, speaking to people whose parents or grandparents remembered it. And it just became more and more layered. So to introduce the family, this is the Irving family. James, Margaret and Vorry, daughter on the right. And in autumn 1931, they claimed that a little animal had begun speaking to them on their very remote farm on the Isle of Man in the southwestern region. They said it had the power of speech, and it would sing and tell jokes, sing hymns sometimes, and it would discuss philosophy and local gossip. Sometimes it spoke in English, it knew a bit of Manx, sometimes it spoke in Hebrew or Spanish, and it said various things. When the Irvings asked, you know, what are you? It said, I am an earthbound spirit, or I am not a spirit, I am just a little extra clever mongoose. I am a ghost in the form of a weasel, and I shall haunt you with weird noises and clanking chains. I'll split the atom. I am the fifth dimension. I'm the eighth wonder of the world. And rather teasingly, he said, if you knew what I knew, you'd know a hell of a lot. So just some background about the Irving family. The parents, James and Margaret, had moved from Liverpool to the Isle of Man in 1917. They weren't native Manx people. Margaret, her mother was Manx, which I think is where the connection, how they heard about this derelict farm for sale. Irving was quite a successful, this has all gone terribly wrong, there we go. Irving was quite a successful piano and organ salesman in Liverpool before the World War I. But there was some quite punishing tariffs put an end to this trade. He was doing quite well. They were earning, well, £600 a year in 1910. It's about 35,000 a year today. But as I say, the business collapsed. He decided to change lifestyle, go to the Isle of Man, become a farmer with no experience whatsoever. I was a little suspicious about his claims, and I did go to Liverpool to check out the addresses where they'd lived. Now, they don't look very affluent now, but I was told by a sort of local researcher, archivist chap there, said if these areas 100 years ago would have been quite affluent, and looking at the censuses for 1901, 1911, you can see the neighbours weren't manual labourers, they were office workers or businessmen, and even just living in your own house rather than sharing it with another family would be a sign of prosperity. So that's one of their places. This is terribly shaky. I think Jeff's got into the PowerPoint. Yeah, Botanic Place. You see, it looks quite drab, but it would have been quite desirable because it was near these Wavertree Botanic Gardens. So I'm inclined to believe him that he was earning a nice, decent amount of money from this piano and organ import business, which did collapse, and hence he decided to try a second career on the Isle of Man. Now, he did most of the talking when Harry Price went over there. But what Price observed is that Margaret, his wife, was, and this is Price's words, the most striking personality in the household, a tallish woman of 59, of dignified bearing, the most compelling feature, two magnetic eyes that haunt the visitor with their almost uncanny power. Mrs. Irving belongs to a type that you would guess at first glance to be psychic, and this was something that other visitors, spiritualist mediums, and people who entered the house said that there was a presence there, and it was centered around Margaret. Or one medium said she felt she was about to be taken over, go under control. She didn't ostensibly have any knowledge or interest in spiritualism. I think she rather liked the idea of it. And when Gef used to call her Maggie the Witch Woman, she didn't seem to object. So James was 46 and Margaret was 42 when the daughter Vorry was born. So they were quite old. They were two older children, a son and a daughter. This is Vorry here. She's about 12 there. No, she's about 17 now, to lie. She was 17 when Price first met her, but she was 12 when the whole mongoose mystery began. Price says of her, she carries something of her mother's strange look in her greenish brown eyes, which seem to observe the world with a penetrating yet half concealed disdain. She was, by all accounts, intelligent. She was interested in animals. She was also quite mechanically minded, and she later went on to work in an engineering factory. I was told by someone who knew her that she was considered a bit wild. She was a bit untamed, and there's a cruel nickname for her at the local school was Goatie. Apparently she smelled of goats, and this is why, because she looked after the goats. She'd led a fairly sheltered existence. She'd never travelled outside the Isle of Man. She'd never even visited the north of the island. She was seen by people wandering the hills, talking to herself, singing to herself, talking to the dog. Rather sad in some ways. This is what's left of the farmhouse. It was demolished in around 1971. It's very isolated. It's quite hard to get to. There's no actual road. There's a path which can get quite boggy if it's been raining. You see, it's Gef. Yeah, that's really all you can. That's what remains of it. These stones, and sorry about this. Now, the reason why it was demolished is unclear. I've been variously told the farmer who now owns the land didn't want sightseers going up there. Also that he used the brickwork to make as a cattle shed just up the hill. It seems odd though, because there weren't really, it's not accessible. I can't imagine it would be somewhere like Crowley's Abbey of Thelema at Cefalù, where it's quite easy in Sicily to get there, and there is evidence of people hanging out there and drinking. So for whatever reason, it was demolished. I know the roof was falling in, so maybe it was a hazard. It was on this hillside, so it's 1 mile away from the nearest village, which is Dalby. Sometimes they wouldn't have any visitors for months at a time, particularly in winter when they could be snowed in. They didn't have plumbing water. There was a well. That's the well, which is apparently medieval in construction. It was a small 2-story, 2-bedroomed house, and it was very dark inside. It was lit by petrol lamps. There's no electricity, no radio, no telephone, and the interior walls had been panelled with wooden panelling as an insulation against the bitter cold. I think there's a picture of Irving. No. Anyway, what I was going to say is that the wooden panelling was just about a gap was left, about 4 inches, which would just be enough for a little animal to run around all over. I'm very sorry about this. There, that's the wooden panelling there, and behind that there's a gap 4 inches. So in theory, a real physical animal could have rushed all around the house. And could have created an echo, which is something that Price and Lambert hypothesized, but didn't unfortunately actually test, which would have been a good idea. Their theory was that someone standing on the first floor shouting into a little gap could then transmit sound all around the house, which would explain Gef's voice, which would appear very loudly in different parts of the building, but they didn't actually test it. So Gef's first appearances, as I say, they began in autumn 1931. And then he was a weasel-like animal that could talk. And this is very irritating. So I'm just going to try something 1 minute. Right, that's better. Okay, so at first the story just spread on the island and it started to appear in the local newspapers. So this is the Isle of Man Examiner. And then the word spread to Britain, and a journalist from the Manchester Daily Dispatch. This is incredibly annoying. Yes, the Manchester Daily Dispatch reporter went to find out what was going on. I don't know if you can see it all. Man Weasel Mystery Grips Island. The queerest beast talks to Daily Dispatch reporter. He gives a tip for the Grand National. Sadly, I checked out the tip, and the horse that Gef tipped to win the National not only didn't win, but it wasn't even placed. So my advice would be, if you get racing tips from a talking mongoose, just ignore it because you'll waste your money. I'll read a bit of this because I think it's interesting. It's not scornful or comical at all. The mysterious man weasel of Dawlish Cashen has spoken to me today, the journalist begins. Investigation of the most remarkable animal story that has ever been given publicity, a story which is finding credence all over the island, leaves me in a state of considerable perplexity. Had I heard a weasel speak? I do not know, but I do know that I have heard today a voice which I should never have imagined could issue from a human throat. The people who claim it was the voice of the strange weasel, the Irving family, seem sane, honest and responsible folk, and not likely to indulge in a difficult, long drawn out and practical joke which is unprofitable to them and make themselves a laughing stock. Mr. Irving opened the door. I told him I'd come to inquire about the rumour that the house was haunted. Come in, said Irving, there are no spooks here. Nothing that has happened is supernatural. I'm being worried to death by crowds of people visiting the place. Come in, I'll tell you all about it. And he explained to the journalist that in September, they first heard strange sounds behind the wooden panelling. Him and his daughter saw this beast, as he described it, a little animal resembling a stoat, a ferret or a weasel, yellow in colour with a body about 9 inches long. Its long bushy tail is speckled with black. It is thin and could get through a very small hole. It appears in the house from time to time, and I made attempts to catch Jack. About November, we first heard a strange voice coming from behind the woodwork, singing sentences of hymns and songs. Now, I think it's interesting to note at this point that at this stage, he's calling Gef Jack, and he's referring to him as a weasel, although Gef did say he was a ghost in the form of a weasel. And shortly after this, he expressed a preference for the name Gef, which he spelt phonetically G-E-F. He said he wasn't a weasel, and actually he was a mongoose. Now, oddly enough, I found mongooses aren't entirely unknown on the Isle of Man. In fact, a nearby farm about 6 or 7 miles south of here, called Erie Coshlin in 1912, so this is 20 years before, the farmer there had imported a dozen mongooses to control the rabbits, because there's apparently no foxes on the Isle of Man, so the rabbit population gets out of control. So there are, well, there were, I should say, mongooses there. I believe there still are. I've heard of at least 2 modern sightings. Jenny Randalls, the ufologist, writes about her own sighting in the early 2000s in the book's Supernatural Isle of Man. And I met someone there who took me to the site where he'd seen this mongoose, and he was, you know, a very believable person. There was no reason for him to make this up. But the thing is, they both describe a mongoose much bigger than Gef. So both Jenny Randalls and this fellow I spoke to described. So the artist impression, let's just go through that. It's 12 inches. This is all based on the Irving's reports to Harry Price, who commissioned this artist impression. So 6 inches plus a 6-inch bushy tail. I think it looks rather like a squirrel or a hedgehog. You may differ. The eyelashes are very fetching. Look at his paws, they're human paws, and this is one of the most bizarre aspects of it. The Irving family insisted that although he was a little weasel or mongoose, he had human-like hands with which he could light a match or hold a torch or play with his rubber ball or steal objects from nearby farms. So this is a 6 inches plus 6 inches. However, if you go into venture into the world of mongooses, this character is about 3 foot long. This is the kind of mongoose that was described by Jenny Randalls and my informant. I think that's called a yellow mongoose. It's a bit like a fox, certainly much too big for Gef. The colour's about right. There's this one, it's a marsh mongoose. Gef did say he was a marsh mongoose. He said a lot of things, but at one point he said he was a marsh mongoose. The face doesn't look quite like the artist impression. This is also too big. This is about 2 foot long. There was only one mongoose I could find that was about the right size, and that is the dwarf mongoose there. But that doesn't really look like the artist's impression, and that doesn't really seem to match up like the Irving's descriptions. And this character, this dwarf mongoose, comes from Southern Africa, where Gef was most insistent that he came from Delhi, India, and he was shot at by Indians, and he escaped and travelled through ancient Egypt, or not ancient Egypt, but Egypt, seeing the ancient sites, and eventually found his way to the Isle of Man. So he said he was from India, and this mongoose isn't. So none of these mongooses quite match up. So I'm inclined to take that claim that he was a mongoose with a pinch of salt, but call me a cynic. The first few months were very distressing for the Irvings. They didn't know what this thing was. It had invaded their home. It was apparently quite hostile. It used to throw objects at them, keep them awake at night. It spat at them, was banging and crashing. It seemed to want them to leave. They were kept awake at night by what Irving describes as Jeff's satanic laughter. It made death threats. He put poison down to try and kill. He still thinking it was a rat. He didn't at this stage think it was supernatural. He thought it was a talking rat or weasel. So he put down poison. Terrible screams were soon heard, lasting for about 20 minutes at a time. But at the end, Jeff just laughed and said, "Oh, you can't kill me." Rory seemed to be the focus of its attentions. The daughter seemed to be its main attraction, and fearing for her safety, the parents decided that the daughter should sleep in their bedroom so she wouldn't be alone. And as the bed was dismantled, the animal, who was behind the wooden matchboarding, screamed, stormed, and threatened what he would do to us. The voice was absolutely full of malice, hatred, and spleen, and he was striking the matchboarding with his fist with the greatest violence. So this is a perplexing aspect, that this little 12-inch creature was able to bang on the wooden paneling and make a terrible racket. So it's very strange. Eventually they moved Rory's bed into the parents' bedroom, but they heard this scream, "I'll follow her wherever you move her." So it's quite terrifying, really. However, after a few months, they managed to establish a truce, and it seemed to have been, rather than putting poison down, they accepted that he was there to stay, that he was in the house as a resident just as much as they were. And they began to leave food out for him: biscuits, potato pie, bacon, chocolate and cakes, and this seemed to placate him. "You can let Rory go back to her own room. I won't hurt any of you now." And in exchange for this food, it would catch rabbits, which it would leave outside the house, and they would be found still warm, killed by having one eye poked out. It's very strange, because that's not how a weasel would typically kill a rabbit. This was very useful for the Irving family, because not only did it supplement their diets, they were very poor. I probably admitted that, but I should say the farming business wasn't a success. And at the time of Jeff's appearances, they were on a very low income, and it would be the equivalent of about £1,500 today. And that's for 3 people and a dog, and possibly a mongoose to support. So they were really desperately poor. So the rabbits were useful. They could eat them. They could take them down to the village and sell them. Jeff also helped by keeping the farm buildings free from rats, and he would find lost sheep and duck eggs that were lost. "If you are kind to me, I will bring you good luck. If you are not kind, I shall kill all your poultry. I can get them wherever you put them. I am not evil. I could be if I wanted. You don't know what damage or harm I could do if I were roused. I could kill you all, but I won't." So, is there any evidence for this? I hear you ask. So far, we've only heard the Irving family's version of events. Well, there are some other witnesses. An old friend of Irving's, Charles Morrison, a businessman in Liverpool who knew from years and years back, he steadfastly defended Irving's integrity, and he absolutely insisted that James Irving wouldn't make this up. And he visited the Isle of Man, visited family on several occasions, and he heard Jeff speaking, as did his son, who was initially very skeptical. Now, Jeff spent a lot of his time traveling around the island, picking up gossip and information about people and places, what was going on, apparently facts of which the family wouldn't have any prior knowledge. And one of his favourite haunts was, sorry about this is very irritating, the Peel bus depot, which is still there. And he used to eavesdrop on the bus drivers and the engineers. So one day, Irving and his friend Charles Morrison were in Peel, the city of Peel where this bus depot is, and they started chatting to one of the bus drivers. And Morrison asked him, did he believe in Jeff? And this is what the driver replied: "I cannot help myself. I've got to believe. When Mr. Irving here can tell me all the contents of my house, even in rooms that cannot be seen from the outside. And there has not been any strangers in my house. Now, apparently this chap lived on his own in rooms on the first floor, where he claimed it would be impossible to look in. I found the house, I'm pretty sure I found it. It was the flat where he lived was in a house above a chemist in Peel, and it would have been very difficult. I couldn't see, short of climbing up the drain pipe around the back, how you could see in, unless you were a very nimble weasel. This bus driver continued. Certain of the employees at Peel disliked to see Mr. Irving coming to the bus depot, as he was able to detect some of their conversations and their actions. So they're transferring it onto James Irving. Detect some of their actions and conversations when they were alone, or rather when they thought they were alone. And the famous quote from the bus depot was, "That mongoose knows too much." It seemed to be spying on their secrets and they didn't like it. Captain Dennis was a member of Harry Price's National Laboratory of Psychical Research. He was sent to the Isle of Man to investigate all this. Dennis was described by Price as very shrewd and not easily hoodwinked. He was an ex-naval man, a motorbike rider, very wealthy. He lived in Pulborough in the same place as Price. Very trusted by Price. Now, he visited the farm on 3 separate occasions. During the first visit, which was February 1935, he saw a large needle being thrown at the teapot from somewhere behind the wooden panelling, and he heard plates being moved in the scullery when he was certain there was no one there. Another time he went there later, not that year, he arrived at 5:30 in the afternoon. He waited some hours for Gef to make an appearance. He was chatting to the Irving family. By 11 p.m, Mrs. Irving said, well, there's nothing happening. So she told Rory, the daughter, to go upstairs to bed. Dennis and Irving both ascertained that she had actually gone to bed. She was in her bedroom. And then half an hour later, a few knocks were heard. So Dennis shouted, "Come on, Gef, if you won't talk, make a noise." And in response, this is from his diary, raps of various qualities of sound started from different points of the house with great rapidity. I then heard a bedroom door banged with extraordinary violence, so suggested we go upstairs to see what had happened. At that minute, a shrill, very excited and highly pitched voice screamed out, "Go and look!" So up we went and looked, and we found the fastener on the outside of Rory's door was turned down, so she could not get out of the room. It's a rather peculiar fact that there was a latch on the outside of their daughter's bedroom door, so they would lock her in. It's been suggested she was a sleepwalker. I'm still not quite sure why they did that, but at least it could prove that she was in there. Once she was in, she couldn't get out, because Captain Dennis tried this himself. He said, well, I'll go in there, lock me in, and he couldn't find a way to get her. So he was fairly convinced that whatever noise was going on in the house, it wasn't the daughter, because she was locked in her bedroom. He continues, we again saw Rory in bed. She said Gef was overhead between the slate roof and the ceiling. Now, he was said to live here. The wooden paneling which used to cover the very top of the staircase, just below the roof. So the chair there is apparently his exercise chair. He used to push that up and down. This is where they used to leave food for him. And he used to have a little rubber ball that he would bounce up and down for sort of entertainment, I suppose. The voice then started in earnest, and the noise in the house was amazing. Shrill screams accompanied by terrific knocking, loud bangs emanated from all parts of the house in quick succession, as if the perpetrator moved with lightning speed. That's the thing, these sounds were echoing all around in different parts of the house very fast. The noise continued for about 15 minutes, culminating with tremendous bangs, as if something had been thrown with great violence, which was apparently the chair, throwing the chair down. When they asked Gef to stop, he said, "I'll throw pebbles now at the window." And almost at once we heard rattling against the windows, just as if gravel and sand and small stones were being hurled at them. Mrs. Irving got rather perturbed and she told Gef to stop as she did not want her windows to be broken. Now, Dennis's first thought was this must be the daughter, but he went up to her room. As I say, he found out there was a latch on the outside. She was inside. He did try to see if he could get out when this latch was turned, and he said it was impossible. So he was fairly convinced. Another time he visited, in May of that year, 1935, he heard Gef's voice seemingly coming from behind the wooden panelling in the front room. And at this time, Mr. and Mrs. Irving were in full view. He was talking to them. And the daughter was 100 feet away. He could see her. She was outside the house in a stackyard. She was feeding the chickens. So that was perplexing because he could see the two parents and then he could hear this voice from behind the wooden panelling. So Irving is quite, I think, is quite a reliable witness. This is Nandor Fodor, psychoanalyst, lawyer, author, prolific author. He wrote lots of books about poltergeists, mediums, ghosts, this sort of thing. He was a research officer for the SPR. Now, he took a great interest in the Gef case, and I would say his investigation was far more thorough than Price's, because Price was there for a couple of days, but Fodor stayed there for a week, and he interviewed lots of people around the area. He tracked down all various people that Irving had mentioned who'd seen or heard Gef. Harry Hall was a 19-year-old boy by the time Fodor was there in 37, but he'd been a 14-year-old when he'd heard and also seen Gef. He described the voice as a very high, screechy sort. The postman also was interviewed, and he heard a very high-pitched voice while he was standing in the kitchen with Jim and Rory. So he didn't think it was either of those two. First words of the postman were hard to understand, but once I got used to it, I could follow every word. I would say that the voice is a full octave higher than the human voice. There is no doubt in my mind that I heard Gef. He did not use very nice language. Put the bloody gramophone on is a fair example of his speech. Now, amongst Irving's very lengthy diaries and letters, there are numerous other examples of uncanny events being witnessed by local people. These are, I guess, of less value because we only have his word for it, rather than in the cases where Fodor tracked down the individuals concerned. But there is something about Irving's sheer insistence, page after page. It's very obsessive. You see these diaries and letters written over a period of several years that, together with the mundane nature of these episodes, gives them, to me, some kind of authenticity. I would have thought, if I was going to fabricate a talking spirit or entity, I would make it announce matters of grave importance in the mid-30s, fears of another depression, the rise of Hitler, threat of another world war, nothing like that at all. Instead, it was, the farmer down the road has lost his chicken, or his wife's knitting him a jumper, someone's painted a new barn. It was all quite mundane stuff. Some other locals' experiences of Gef. So the two schoolboys, one of whom heard Gef and described it to Fodor, Will Cubb and Harry Hall, who were 15 and 14-year-olds at the time. I saw Gef, he said. I saw Gef in the field behind the chapel. He was little and he had a flat face. It was yellow and a big bushy tail. So again, this is more like the artist's impression. And one of a gang of road repair workers was having his lunch. They were working on retarmacking the road that was just a mile down from the farm. One of these guys was having a sandwich. He threw a mouldy bit of bread into the field. And then he was amazed to see this piece of bread moving of its own accord, as invisibly. A cousin of Irving's, a man called Cyril Oates, was tilling a field next to Dawlish Cashen, the farm, and a stone was thrown at him over the hedge. He went over to look, and there was no one in the field, and there's nowhere up there where you could really hide. It's quite open ground, so he couldn't understand that. 3 young fishermen visited the house. They wanted to see Gef. While in conversation with Irving, one of them suddenly stopped talking and said the white cat had just jumped up on his knee. The Irvings didn't own a white cat. There weren't any neighbours, and he had no knowledge of any white cats. There are some suggestions that Gef shape-shifted. There's another episode where he appears to have transformed into a cat. He doesn't say whether it was a Manx cat. I think there may have been a tail, so that's another mystery. More evidence, more dubious evidence. Hair samples. Irving sent Price some hairs that supposedly Gef had pulled from his own back and his tail. These are from the Price collection. Subsequently, these hairs were sent to a Mr. F. Martin Duncan. Price sent them to an expert from the Zoological Society to be analysed. And the report came back. I can very definitely say that the specimen hairs never grew upon a mongoose, nor are they those of a rat, rabbit, hare, squirrel, or other rodent. I am inclined to think that these hairs have probably been taken from a longish-haired dog. And indeed, when Price went to visit, he did meet up with Mona, the friendly sheepdog belonging to the family, and he secretly managed to snip off some hairs from Mona's back to compare them, and lo and behold, they're exactly the same. So this is rather dodgy. Paw prints. Price sent some modelling clay up to the Irvings to try and get some proof, objective proof of Gef. This is what came back. Now, there's several things wrong with this. The top 2, so on the left, that's supposed to be his front paw open, with the claws open, and on the right, closed. The bottom middle one is supposed to be his back paw, so already you can see there's huge disparity in size. And on the bottom right, it's meant to be his teeth marks, but there's no fissures or little, not fingerprints exactly, but what it looks like to me is someone's got a stick and has prodded some clay with a stick. I hate to be cynical, but there you go. This was actually sent to the same Zoological Society expert, and the response came back. There's no known animal who has such a disparity between the size of its front and its rear paws. So this is very strange. Gef did do a self-portrait, but the results, if I can get that up, were rather disappointing. Even Irving describes it as a crude sketch. I think it's supposed to be his head, but it's quite impressive that he could grasp a pencil at all, I suppose. So I don't think we've got some very strong evidence there. The photographs, in my opinion, may be stronger evidence. You may disagree. Gef was very reluctant to be photographed, and it was a great deal of persuasion to get him to be photographed. Gef is averse to being photoed, said Irving, and if it were not for my wife's insistence and persistence, there would be no photos, as Gef obeys my wife only, and only that within certain limits. And he said Gef gave various reasons why he didn't want to be photographed. I am a freak, he said at one point. I have hands and I have feet, and if you saw me, you'd faint. You'd be petrified, mummified, turned into stone or a pillar of salt. So it was as if he didn't want to frighten or shock them. Even before the photos, it was very difficult to get him to show himself, but they clearly did, because all 3 of them claimed to have seen him. This is one of the first. This is the first set of 1 of 4. There's that and there's that. Believe it or not, these are the best 2 out of a set of 4. Now, Vori was still getting used to the camera, but it's fairly useless. I mean, it could be a standing stone or it could be anything really. However, as she got more used to the camera, and as Gef became less camera shy, things did get a bit clearer. This one you may have seen before. So what you're supposed to be looking at is Gef's head on the left, some blades of grass, then his back, and then on the right, the bushy tail, and he's meant to be sitting on top of a hedge. It may not look very good, but if you see the original, you'll see that the blades of grass are in front of some kind of dark object. I found some other ones at the Society of Psychical Research archives, which I think these have been less well known. Let's have a look. This is apparently Gef. There seems to be a stripe going down his middle. I think there's a reverse image there. So it's been enhanced, but quite a cute little thing, but it looks a bit like a skunk, very small. There's another one here, side view. So again, you've got that stripe. Tail, I think, is going over the back, like a squirrel sometimes does. Now, I made my own very scientific investigation and had a friend knit me a Gef of the right. Oh God, what's gone wrong? It's all going very wrong. Okay, I'll just pause there because that gives the relative size of supposedly Gef looking rather like a Manx cat on the fence. And as I say, I had a Gef made 12 inches long, same size. Found, I think it's the same fence because most of the area, most of the farm and its house have been demolished. So that, if we go back, looks like a cat, but would be about 12 inches long. So it's too small to be a cat. It's been suggested that these were fox furs, cleverly arranged. You know, ladies would wear fox stoles. Fodor, in fact, did, while he was staying there, go through all the drawers looking for, maybe he thought Margaret had one of these fox stoles, he couldn't find one. It occurred to me that maybe if the daughter was catching rabbits, could she have used the fur from the rabbits? There's no proof of that either. There's one more, I think, after that one. Yeah, so again, it's 12 inches in length, but it looks like there's some kind of a tail hanging down. Well, that's about all the evidence in terms of material evidence that there exists, as far as I'm aware. So what do we conclude from this? Clearly there is some element of hoax. The hair samples, certainly, the paw prints. You may think the photographs also. I spoke to several Manx residents and, asked them what their parents or grandparents had thought, and it was generally believed in the area that the whole thing was a fraud, that it was a hoax perpetrated by the mother and the daughter, and that poor old Irving had been taken for a ride. And the belief was that they didn't like it there, they wanted to move back to Liverpool, and they were trying to frighten him into selling up and leaving. Well, it has to be said, if that was their intention, it was very unsuccessful, because he certainly didn't sell up. In fact, they stayed there. They only left when James died in 1945. Kathleen Green, who was a childhood friend of Rory's at the school, said Rory was an accomplished ventriloquist. And this is hinted at in the Manchester Daily Dispatch's report. Yeah, clue to mystery of talking weasel. Schoolgirl may have powers of ventriloquism. Kathleen Green was quite scared of Rory, but she did say she'd heard her through her voice. So that's possibly explanation for some of it. It doesn't really explain how the two boys saw Gef in the field behind the chapel, or how the workers at the bus depot felt they were being spied on, and that Jim Irving knew all their secrets. In the book about the events that Price and Lambert wrote, they said Gef had an affinity or attraction for Vory and seemed to go where she went and to speak usually when she wished. Accordingly, they wrote, it was but a short step to argue that Vory must be a natural ventriloquist. But Price didn't accept this explanation, and it's because of the impossibility of actually throwing the voice. So distant voice ventriloquism, where the voice is seemingly projected to a location somewhere else in the room or on the stage, it's not, you're not actually throwing a voice, it's an illusion. So the ventriloquist speaks his voice in a muted way and then misdirects the audience to another part of the stage. So it's the art of throwing the voice is a myth, and Price was well aware of this because of his expertise in conjuring magic, membership of the magic circle, and the great conjuring library he'd built up with all the magic tricks. So he wasn't really convinced that that was an explanation. He did think it was a hoax, but not for financial reasons. I'll get onto that a bit later. If the whole thing was a hoax, then James Irving must surely have known, because they couldn't have, the mother and the daughter couldn't have kept this up for, well, it would be 5, 6, 7 years without him finding out. But he never states this in his diaries. He also says Gef spoke to him when he was alone, when his wife was visiting a sick mother in Peel and when his daughter was at school. He talks of touching Gef. Thursday, May 12, 1932, took hold of my fingers with his hand several times. Mrs. Irving writes about putting her fingers in Gef's mouth and feeling the sharp little teeth. So who was perpetrating a hoax against who? Nandor Fodor did repeat this, having lived there for a week. It was so small and crowded that it would be impossible to maintain this hoax without being detected. Price still thought it was a hoax, not for financial gain, but you see, despite their great poverty, this some equivalent of £1,500 a year to live on, they refused money. A national newspaper wanted to purchase one of the photos that we saw earlier, wanted to get the negative. 3 guineas, which would have been a fair amount of money, given their poor circumstances. And James Irving refused. He said, oh, it's so difficult to get pictures of Gef, but I don't want to part with any of them. A US film producer offered a huge sum, $50,000, half of it upfront in cash for the exclusive rights to Gef. Again, Irving refused. So Price argued that there was a hoax, but for a psychological motive. And he wrote in an unpublished letter to one of his correspondents, I agree that the whole family must be mixed up in it, but there still remains the question of motive. It certainly is not to draw people to the farmhouse, because they do their utmost to keep them away. The motive lies much deeper than mere publicity. And he goes on to say that in his book, Haunting of Cashlan's Gap, we have emphasized the evidence for the fraudulent side while admitting the case has an interesting psychological dimension. Basically, he was scared of being sued by Irving if he came out and said, this is a big old fraud. But he did seem to think it was the loneliness of the Irvings, having no radio, TV, no neighbours, particularly the daughter, had led to a collective delusion. Although if it was loneliness, you might expect them to welcome visitors. And in fact, Irving complained of people turning up there, especially on a Friday and a Saturday night, and damaging the farm. He even had to put an advert in the local paper to say no at visitors, without prior arrangement. So they can't have been lonely in that respect. Also, if it was a delusion amongst the 3 family members, how does one explain what Captain Dennis observed on 3 occasions? The bus depot workers, Charles Morrison and his son, the road repair workers. From the local paper, Mr. Irving submitted a voluntary statement signed by 3 young men that had heard and witnessed strange happenings at the house, and 15 people altogether who would vouch for this unique experience. And how did Irving come by all this knowledge of people's private lives? Who was leaving the dead rabbits outside the house? So I think it would be a mistake to dismiss the entire thing as a hoax, although clearly the hair samples and the paw prints are fraudulent. I'm reminded of the Cottingley Fairies case, which I'm sure doesn't need an introduction for me. It took decades, I think, for the two, well, by then, women, two girls at the time, to admit that they'd faked the fairy photographs. And even then, I think one of them, I believe, said we had to fake the photographs because no one believed us. No one believed in the fairies. So we were giving proof. And I wonder if there's something of the kind happened with the hair samples, the paw prints, possibly the photographs, some kind of frustration that, well, we know this is true, we've seen it, but you won't believe it. And bearing in mind that Harry Price was putting the family under great pressure to deliver some kind of evidence. Fodor said in one of his books, often supposed poltergeists are caught in the act of perpetrating a fraud. Then scientists are apt to say, I told you so, and ridicule the entire phenomenon. But it must be remembered that when you deal with poltergeists, you deal with unbalanced personalities. Once notoriety has been secured for the person around whom the disturbances occur, he's tempted to fake the manifestations after they've stopped in order to hold the center of the stage. So was it to maintain the center of attention, perhaps? Now, initially, Irving denied there was anything supernatural about Gef. He later came to change his view on this. He seemed to think it was impossible for just a weasel to begin talking, and he started to believe in some kind of supernatural explanation. He talked about Gef's ability to read, and if any of us is reading a paper, periodical, or book, he calls out what's in it, and he must be many feet away behind the wooden paneling. So he thought this can't be just a matter of good eyesight, and how could a mongoose read anyway? He also gave evidence of Gef's supposed clairvoyant ability. So again, this is all from Irving's diaries. 5 to 10 minutes before I reach home, Gef will suddenly call out to my wife, Jim's coming! How he knows it is another mystery, as the lay of the land prevents me from being seen. There was an incident when Irving was outside shearing sheep, 250 or 300 yards from the farmhouse. The wife and the daughter are inside, and Gef is there apparently keeping up some running commentary describing which sheep he's shearing and difficulty he's having. He's fallen over in the mud, and this was all apparently quite accurate. Irving also thought Gef must have had some power of invisibility, which would explain his apparent power to spy on locals without being seen or caught. They'll never catch me. And another possibly supernatural aspect would be the manner in which his physical body was in one place, while his voice would be emanating from another location, sometimes could be 20 or 25 feet away. And this peculiar ability to apparently move around the house with great speed. He commenced to thump in different parts of the house with a wireless-like rapidity that one would have thought there was a half a dozen Gefs. Was Gef a familiar? Well, I rather like this idea, but it does beg the question of what familiar is. Price made the comment, probably quite accurately, that if this had happened 300 or 400 years ago, the family may have been hanged for witchcraft. And I think that's unfortunately true. I suppose we should also bear in mind a lot of these accounts of witchcraft testimony was obtained by torture, but it is strange how often little animals, mice and moles, weasels and ferrets. There was one particular case, if I can possibly show it to you. Yes, Joan Prentice and Bid, who was a little ferret who I think did her bidding, and other people saw Bid as well as her. I think she came to a rather sad end, so I'll move on from that. So even if we accept Gef was a familiar, it still begs the question, what is a familiar? Is it a spirit in the form of an animal? Or is it an animal that's been possessed by a spirit? Or is it literally a talking animal? So that doesn't really get us much further. Poltergeists. The case certainly has several classic poltergeist elements, the knocking and the banging, cracks, objects being moved, stones being thrown, presence of a teenager. The manifestation of a voice I thought was less typical, but when I began to read up on poltergeist, it seemed it wasn't that uncommon. The Enfield poltergeists, very well known. The Bell Witch cases, both of which featured a very garrulous and foul-mouthed deity. There does seem to be a certain personality with which these voices personify their character. Is very irreverent, swearing a lot. It could be a rebellious teenager, perhaps, but like Gef, the Enfield entity, or well, there may have been more than one, but let's say that the first entity initially made animal noises, barking of a dog, which was tape recorded by Guy Playfair, and then it progressed to actual speech, which is exactly what Jim Irving said was the case with Gef, who first started to imitate noises of cows and dogs. And again, teenage girl as focus, who did admit to some fraud, but not all the phenomenon. I think it was about 10% that Playfair and Gross said that they'd caught them out. It's very easy to catch the girls out in fraud, and most of it was quite inexplicable. But even as a poltergeist, Gef doesn't quite fit the bill, because whoever heard of a poltergeist that ate bacon and chocolates and drank water? Gef told the Irvings that his existence was physical and that he must have food to live. Or whoever heard of a poltergeist that could catch a cold? Jim, I have a goddamn cough. I have a hell of a cold. You'll have to get me something. He presumably wanted some kind of cough medicine from the local pharmacy. In my opinion, we'll never know the entire truth, because all the main players are dead. Fraud, poltergeist, or shared delusion, he does fit some of these aspects, but not all of them. I don't think any single explanation is sufficient. As a trickster figure, Gef certainly doesn't want to be pinned down or categorized. There was a South African spiritualist lady who visited the farm, and she rather imperiously demanded that Gef appear. Come here, Gef, I want you. And Jeff's reply immediately came, no damn fear, you'll put me in a bottle. So he doesn't want to be put in a bottle, he doesn't want to be trapped, he doesn't want to be photographed. In reply to Margaret Irving's inquiries as to his true nature, he said, of course I know what I am, and you are not going to get to know, just rather annoying. You're only grigged. Grigged is a Manx word, it means vexed or disappointed. You're only grigged because I won't tell you. I might let you see me sometime, but thou wilt never get to know what I am. And in response to Margaret's expression of disbelief, animal, you're no animal, he said, I know I am not. But again, he wouldn't elaborate as to what he was. Just one last picture, if I possibly can. Yeah, I like this picture of Vori. She looks like a film starish, I think. She's gazing wistfully into the distance. To my knowledge, she only gave 2 interviews, and I've only found one, which was in 1970, nearly 40 years after the events. And this was to a journalist for Fate magazine. We managed to track her down. She'd moved. She kept a very low profile. Somehow he persuaded her to talk. She was reluctant. She still maintained that Gef had not been a hoax, but did not look fondly upon that whole period. I was shy, I still am. He, Gef, he made me meet people I didn't want to meet. Then they said I was mental or a ventriloquist. Believe me, if I was that good, I would jolly well be making money from it now. Gef was very detrimental to my life. We were snubbed. The other children used to call me the spook. So as well as Gef being the Dalby Spook, that was also a nickname for Vorry. The Spook, I had to leave the Isle of Man, and I hope that no one where I work now ever knows the story. Gef has even kept me from getting married. How could I ever tell a man's family about what happened? And in response to the sort of persistent journalist's query as to whether Gef had actually been a mongoose, she said, I don't know. I know he was a small animal, about 9 inches to a foot long. I know he talked to us from behind the wooden paneling. His voice was very high-pitched. He swore a lot. At first, he talked to me more than anyone. We carried on regular conversations. And he asked her outright, was it a hoax or wasn't it? And she said emphatically, it was not a hoax, and I wish it had never happened. If my mother and I had our way, we would never have told anybody about it. But father was sort of wrapped up in it. It was such a wonderful phenomenon that he just had to tell people about it. So I think it's odd, to say the least, that she would still insist on the truth of Gef's existence all these years later. Unlike the Cottingley ladies, she could have cleared up the whole thing after her father died in 1945 by saying, you know, it was just a hoax that got out of hand and let's just forget about it, but she never did. She insisted to a dying day. There was a little animal who talked and did all those other things. He said he was a mongoose and said we should call him Gef, but I do wish he had let us alone. Thank you. That's me.
Thank you very much, Chrstopher. What an interesting story and some beautiful pictures that I think a lot of us will agree that we've not seen before in any other type of Gef stories that's been told. I do